Okay, let's start. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, or good evening, Raffaello, for you. Thank you for staying up so late from Singapore to make this presentation. My name is Adam Blackwell, the Vice President International at Development Services Group, and on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, GTTAC, I'll be moderating this session. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. The views expressed are those of the presenter. Raffaello Pantucci is a senior fellow at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. That's a mouthful. His research there focuses on Central Asia, as well as managing a broad-ranging team looking at the global emergent threats. I believe I met Raffaello when he was at the IISS in London. He is the author most recently of Sinostan, China's Inadvertent Empire, which draws on over a decade's research and travel through Central Asia. He's widely published author in the academic and public press, and he has advised governments in Europe, North America, and Asia on counterterrorism strategies. Raffaello will speak for approximately 20 minutes on terrorism in Central Asia, the threat that does not seem to come home. Then we will have about 20 minutes for dialogue. Please prepare your questions and put them in the Q&A function of Zoom as the talk is proceeding. Raffaello, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, and thank you to the DSG for hosting me for this session. It's a pleasure to join you, even if it is quite late at night my time. Let me first try this wonderful technical thing of making a slide share with you all. We now discover how technically proficient I am. I was a minute ago. I'm gonna hope I'll be able to swing it again. I think I have. If someone could give me a yes, you can see it.
Yes, sir.
Wonderful, excellent. Okay, great. So, yeah, so what I want to talk about today is Central Asia. And the reason I want to talk about this idea of terrorism in Central Asia, the threat does not seem to come home, is that notwithstanding the fact that there is clearly a problem of radicalization extremism within Central Asia that has links elsewhere and is sort of externalized, it doesn't seem to actually be coming back home. And we haven't seen many large-scale attacks in Central Asia in really quite some time. So that's what I want to talk about a bit, and that's the sort of the title of the presentation I'm going for. Now, Adam very generously introduced me already, but there's a very brief summary of my experience so far, and also a quick run through of the presentation I'm going to do. I want to talk a little about Central Asia more broadly. I want to talk about history. I want to touch on Afghanistan and Syria. Then I want to talk about Central Asians going out, and then I want to take us right up to date with what we see happening at the moment. It should be around 20 minutes or so. If I'm going over, I hope Adam or Justin will shut me up. Now, first, I think I'm fascinated by Central Asia. I've done a lot of work on it. As Adam pointed out, I just wrote a book looking at China's relations with the region, which drew on, as I say, more than a decade's travel and research around the region. I find it a fascinating place, but I also find a space you have to have maps to kind of really look at and sort of understand properly. And so here I put up a map which talks about the 5 countries that I'm really talking about, which is the 5 STANs countries: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Now, this is a map that also highlights the Caucasus, which is, of course, relevant because, of course, they were all countries that came about at the same time, which is when the Soviet Union fell apart. So these countries are all 30 years young. So they're still kind of forging their national identity, and that shapes a lot of what they're trying to do and a lot of their sort of domestic and foreign policy. And the important thing about the Caucasus in particular, when we're thinking about counterterrorism questions, is, there's always a kind of narrative of concern in Central Asia of people from the Caucasus and networks from the Caucasus coming over, recruiting and radicalizing. The sort of fear of the Chechen radicalizer or the North Caucasian radicalizer is something that you hear a lot. So these regions are very closely linked. And when we look at sort of the battlefield in Syria and Iraq, when we had ISIS at its sort of heyday there, you'll find that a lot of the kind of Caucasians and the Central Asians tended to fight together, because they all can speak mutually intelligible Russian or languages that are sort of proximate enough that they could get by. So there is quite a strong link, though at the moment, this presentation, I'm going to really try to focus on the 5 STANs countries in particular. The other thing, of course, to note about them is that they share a border with Afghanistan. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan do. And this is a border that is very porous. Now, actually, the Uzbek border is relatively secure. It's quite small. There's a river that goes down it. There's a single bridge that cuts across. So, from a security perspective, it's quite easy to isolate yourself from those threats. But the Tajik border is very long, very porous. The US, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians are all investing a lot in trying to help the Tajiks get their capabilities up to actually defend themselves from Afghanistan. And then the Turkmenistan border, which also is quite porous, we suspect, but Turkmenistan's a bit of a black hole of information, frankly speaking. So it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on, but the suspicion is there's probably some transit trade of drugs or some other things across that border, which is keeping it relatively quiet. But I think it's always useful when we think about Central Asia to start by looking at the region we're talking about and understanding how landlocked it is and how close it is, frankly, to Afghanistan and also to Syria and Iraq, where, of course, we've had two of the largest jihadist conflicts over the past few years. Now, in this slide, I'm summarizing an awful lot of information very rapidly because this entire presentation, I'm compressing a lot of history very rapidly. But I think, look, the first thing to start with, when we think about terrorism in the region, is, as I said before, this is a region that's 30 years young. When we saw the Soviet Union end and this region became 5 independent countries from being, being part of the Soviet Union or Russia at the time, it was the region that actually let go last. In fact, the Central Asians, probably some of them didn't really want actually independence. They quite liked being part of kind of Mother Russia. But there was trouble in the region, and we saw trouble in the closing days of the Soviet Union in Kazakhstan, some sort of protest that escalated to violence when we had some local leadership change, and in Tajikistan, where there's always been a very difficult balance, ethnic balance in the country. I mean, the other thing to remember about Central Asia is it's incredibly ethnically divided, and so while each country, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, is named after people, in fact, when you dig into it, there are large communities from the other countries or the other peoples living in those countries as well. If we think of Uzbekistan, for example, which is the most populous country in the region with 30 million people, the famous cities of Bukhara and Samarkand are actually majority Tajik cities, ethnically Tajik cities. The people are, of course, Uzbek citizens with passports and everything else, but, ethnically speaking, they're Tajik. So there is a lot of ethnic intermingling. And in Tajikistan in particular, you've got this country which essentially is divided in two, and you've got one side which was the sort of where the ruling elite came from, and sort of they control the country, and then you had the Pamiris, who are the ones who are along the border with Afghanistan, but have a very different and much more independent sort of mind of view. And this fissure led to a civil war throughout the 1990s that made the country very, very dangerous, and became a bit of an offshoot of the conflict that we were seeing in Afghanistan in this time, of course, as well. Because what you saw happening was the civil war managed to take on some of the flavor of a jihadist struggle. And you saw people from Afghanistan go into Tajikistan to participate in the civil war. And groups in Tajikistan would build links and use networks and training camps in Afghanistan to conduct their civil war. But what you also see is the violence spreads around the region. And this is something that happens in the late 1990s. As the countries, at this point, they're coming up to, their first decade of existence, and they were still struggling with trying to sort of define themselves and figure out what their role was and how their economies would function. And you had these violent groups, frankly, who were advocating for, overthrow of the secular regimes. The Islamic movement to Uzbekistan is the most famous one. In 1999, they were blamed for a series of bombings in downtown Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan. But the IMU is also linked to some large invasions that you saw in the south of Kyrgyzstan in 1999 and 2000, where sort of large numbers of these fighters, a lot of them with equipment that they picked up in either the Tajik civil war or in Afghanistan, sort of swept in and took over some villages in the south. Now, it was very difficult to get precise information about what happened, but they did kidnap some foreigners as well, and there was certain things. So there was a kind of threat from terrorism and insurgency. It was very much linked to, the sort of jihadist strain that you saw coming out of Afghanistan. And this even actually stretched into China. I think China is always important to think about within this context, because China has Xinjiang, its westernmost region, which shares a border with Central Asia, and has within it many of the same issues in some ways that you'd see within Central Asia. You have a minority community of Uyghurs who are ethnically closer to the Central Asian Turkic peoples, so like the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, than they are certainly to ethnic Han Chinese that we'll traditionally think of as Chinese. But there's about 10 million of them living in Xinjiang, and they have also, some of them have caught the kind of jihadi bug and gone and fought with groups and got inspired by this to try to advocate for their own independent homeland within China. And throughout the 1990s, you saw some pretty large-scale clashes going on in Xinjiang. Now, it's very difficult. Do we call them terrorism? Do we call them, unhappy people rebelling against the state? Do we call them insurgents, freedom fighters? I don't know. It's very difficult. But certainly the Chinese state has always seen them as terrorists. I think that's important to remember because that ties China to the region in a very interesting way. Because if you think of the first sort of big multilateral organization that the Chinese created on the world stage, that was very much centered on this region, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The first thing that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization focuses on, it of course had a precursor organization called the Shanghai Five, which is all about delineating borders between China and these new countries of the former Soviet Union. But the SCO, when it comes about in 2001, focused on terrorism as the issue that can bring all of these countries together, that they can all agree on, that they can all see a common threat and problem from. So they work quite closely with the Chinese, as well as, of course, the Russians, who have long-standing connections and links to the region. And what we see happening basically after sort of 2000 and the, American-led invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq, is, Central Asians become a fairly common feature of jihadi struggles. Now, most of them, frankly, stayed in Afghanistan for the conflict that was happening there. Most of them were joining the Islamic movement to Uzbekistan, which is kind of the central organization. But there were sort of other, Tajik groups that sort of formed during this period. There were smaller Kazakh groups that formed during this period. There was Kyrgyz groups that formed during this period. That they were all, focused on fighting within Afghanistan. And they talked a lot about going back home and doing things. And you did see some incidents back in Central Asia during this period, but relatively limited ones, I would say. You saw some sort of various small scale attacks happening at various moments. The authorities arresting a lot of people, but not actually, no real large scale kind of 9/11 style massive spectacular. It's much more smaller stuff, frankly, but some of it was definitely linked to groups that we saw in Afghanistan and Pakistan. When the war in Syria took off, we see a large number of Central Asians heading over there, very much inspired by the narratives of Hijra and joining the caravan of martyrs and fighting with these warriors to build this sort of perfect Islamic state that ISIS claimed to be creating. And they kind of become quite an important part of the battlefield in Syria, and they still are to this day. There's a organization called KTJ, Katiba Tawhid wal Jihad, which is kind of the central one that a lot of them are sort of grouped around in there, and it's still operating in the sort of part of Idlib that's controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and have pledged allegiance to the group and fight alongside them. So, they've been a very active part of the conflict in Syria, and again, they were always talking about, threats back home, but you never really saw them materialize. You did also see Central Asians showing up as kind of shock troops in some pretty dramatic attacks around the kind of wider region. I think the most dramatic one I can think of was in 2014, when a group that was linked to the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan launched an attack in Pakistan on the Karachi International Airport on behalf of the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, which I think shows you the degree to which Central Asians are kind of intermingled with the kind of jihadi milieu that you have there, and were willing to actually be quite sort of aggressive fighters in this regard. But throughout this entire period, the kind of attacks that we see back in Central Asia are quite limited. They're really sort of sporadic. But what we do instead see, and this really starts to take off in the sort of late 2010s, is a growth of Central Asians showing up either as key figures in ISIS. And here, if you look right at the bottom, there's a gentleman called Gulmurod Halimov, who is a former special forces commander in Tajikistan, who fell out with the leader because he thought the leader was a very un-Islamic man, Mr. Rahman, and he went off to join ISIS and had and played a very key role. He became kind of the minister of war for some period for the group. He's believed to be dead now, but his death has been reported a few times, so who really knows? But I suspect this time it might be the case. But the key thing is that Central Asians really rise up the ranks of ISIS, and Tajiks in particular become a really important group within ISIS fighting in Syria and Iraq. And we see, through data leaks of their attendance records or appearances in the registration forms for when they went to join ISIS, we see a lot of the Tajiks were willing to go and be suicide bombers. An awful lot of them actually did go and become suicide bombers. So they were very, very eager to sort of participate in the struggle, and large numbers of them went over there. But what we also see happen is attacks starting to show up in other places, by Central Asians. And we have here a number of them. So we have one on the top, the chap with a very rich beard is a chap who launched an attack in New York, in fact, in 2017. And you can see the FBI there parading afterwards. On the far side, you have a chap who drove a truck through a crowd in Stockholm. Below him, you have a chap who blew himself up in St. Petersburg metro. And the little picture you can see in the middle is a chap who was sent by ISIS to shoot up a nightclub in Istanbul, Turkey, on New Year's Eve 2016. That same year, we also saw a large group of Central Asians launch an attack in Ankara at the airport, launched another attack in Istanbul at the airport. So Central Asians really start to show up in attacks everywhere else. Now, this previously had been quite rare, frankly. You know, it hadn't been the case. Central Asians tended to either stay in Afghanistan or stay in Syria, but they didn't seem to be showing up in plots everywhere, even though they'd been part of the kind of jihadist milieu for a very long time, and there's a very clear kind of strong sense of radicalization and motivation amongst this group. But we don't see any of these guys trying to go launch attacks back. I mean, even if you look at the sort of attack records that we see in Central Asia, you know, there's only Tajikistan suffered a few attacks for 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was the last ones that they had, which are pretty horrible, but were relatively low level. You know, they involve people either stabbing and using cars to run people down. There was an incident at a border spat where a number of people died, but it's very unclear exactly what happened. But the point being that we don't see kind of large scale terrorist direction seeming to come back to Central Asia. And even in the arrest record, we don't necessarily see that either. So it's kind of confusing because we've got this group that's clearly quite radicalized, clearly very close and trusted by the large jihadist groups, so we don't see them going back home to launch attacks, which theoretically would be the kind of key motivating factor for a lot of these people. So it's sort of an interesting question which you can't answer. And now, if we look to today, to take us right up to date, we can actually see that the Islamic State in Khorasan province, the Islamic State affiliate in Afghanistan, has been very vocal in its threats of Central Asia. They publish a lot of material, and they've been publishing material in local languages, using Cyrillic as well as English, as well as pumping stuff out in Arabic. So this shows that they're targeting multiple different audiences. And they've also been using a lot of Central Asians in their attacks. You all may remember that there was an attack just a few days ago now at the Chinese hotel in downtown Kabul. Well, the two attackers appear to have been two Tajiks who were sent by the group to launch this attack. We've seen attacks against the Russian embassy, which I think also was Central Asian. So you've seen Central Asians showing up increasingly in attacks, and ISK in particular has not only been throwing rhetoric, but also been throwing missiles towards Central Asia. Now, they're quite haphazard missiles. There was a series of missile attacks that were done late last year, and I think early this one, but they were dud. One of them, as a friend very amusingly pointed out, this is the one attack that managed to miss the country it was trying to hit. They were firing rockets into Uzbekistan, but they didn't go far enough, and it landed in Afghanistan. So, you know, congratulations. So they were quite a haphazard series of attacks, but at the same time, it's very notable. The ISK is very much seeing a gap there in the fact that Central Asia has had this kind of radical community for a long time, but hasn't had people actually going back and threatening Central Asia, even though there is kind of ample reason, if you look at it through a sort of jihadi lens, to think of why you would want to threaten the Central Asian governments. And then the other thing that we've seen happen this past year is really wide-scale instability across the region, and more widely, frankly, that resonates in the region. And I put up a series of pictures here which illustrate the various parts of it. Up on the top, there's a picture of Tajikistan, which has had two series of problems. They've on the one hand had a shooting war with their neighbors in Kyrgyzstan. As you can see on this map, where you can see Kyrgyzstan is written on the top of it, you can see that there's a kind of little yellow dot just after it. That's an exclave, a Tajik exclave called Voruk. And is that one called Voruk? Yes, no, this is Farah. No, that is Voruk. So there is an exclave there. This has always been a problem because you've got a part of the country that's disconnected from the rest of it. And so connections back and forth are very complicated, but you know, it's always been a source of conflict. But what we've seen over the past 2 years is pretty large scale violence, shooting, war between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, leading to deaths of, I think it was 60 people during the last round. We've also had large violence in Kazakhstan at the beginning of the year. You may remember Kazakhstan, which is always seen as a very stable country in the region, suddenly found itself in the thrust of what looked like a political public upheaval matched with a kind of internal political struggle. And this caused wide-scale trouble and chaos across the country and led to them asking Russia to come and deploy forces. We also saw similar things in Uzbekistan, which is a real surprise to everyone, when the government tried to change its constitution and redefine. There's one region of Uzbekistan called Pakistan, which has traditionally had a kind of autonomous status under the constitution. They tried to change that. The people didn't want it. They protested on the street. We see large-scale violence, and I think about a dozen or 15 people died in this trouble. So we've had large-scale trouble in basically 4 of the countries in this region. We've also had the Taliban take over in Afghanistan, and the Taliban, notwithstanding their endless claims for saying they're going to control, what foreign fighters are within their country, it's abundantly clear they're either unwilling to or unable to. And ISK is a very good example of this. And this is something that's increasingly frustrating the Central Asians, who can see their threat picture is getting worse and can see that it's got a return address to Afghanistan, but can see that the counterparty on the other side, as I say, either doesn't have the will or doesn't have the capability to actually deal with these problems. So it's going to cause a real friction there, and one that really could escalate up. And of course, in the back of Central Asians' minds is the 1990s, and when you had a Taliban controlling Afghanistan then, and the amount of trouble and violence that came out of that in their direction. And then, of course, the other major destabilizing factor, which one has to mention in this context, is, of course, Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine at the beginning of the year, which, of course, doesn't maybe have a direct impact on the kind of CT threat, but what it does mean is, it's had an economic ripple across the region, which actually hasn't been as bad as was expected. But this is a region that's still very economically tied to Russia and was actually quite dependent in some ways on Russian security guarantees. And those security guarantees are no longer as useful as they were in the past. And the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine across the sort of former Soviet space is still really being counted. And what that means for Russia and the country that they have an important relationship with, but it also means Ukraine, which is a country that they had a kind of important relationship, some of them more than others. But there is a lot of kind of wider instability in this region. I think this is an important thing to note, because while we're talking about a region where, as I said, at the beginning of my presentation, it's a place that's had a problem of terrorism radicalization for a very long time, but it hasn't really had the kind of return home factor and the large scale attacks that you might have expected. But we're now in a context where you've got a group next door that's actively talking about attacking them and is trying to, and has been using citizens of these countries at home in attacks. And you've also got the war in Ukraine, which is destabilizing this wider region. And on top of this, you've had instability in, frankly, 4 of the countries, violent instability leading to death in the past year. So I think it's something to watch, because I think we're looking at a region here which has a lot of kindling that could take off. Now, of course, some of this kindling is not new, but it's certainly a big question about what this means for kind of CT threats in this region and how they're going to play out going forwards. Anyway, I will stop there and very much look forward to your questions, corrections, disagreements, and so on. I'll stop sharing as well. But you have my contacts there if you want them. Thank you.
Raffaello, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I have to say, the stands of a region I know very little about. I would ask everybody, please post in the Q&A questions. We have one from our colleague Owen Healy. How much of the terrorism in the region is actually ideological, and how much is ethnic or tribal violence or terrorism?
Gosh, that's very difficult lines to draw, frankly. I think there is quite a strong sense of ideology in the region. I think that when we're just talking about Islam, for example, this is a region which was secular. It is still secular, of course, but the kind of Islam that they were able to practice under the Soviet Union was pretty negligible, non-existent. They were all famous drunks, and in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, there was actually a big discourse about the West was very keen to try to partner with Turkey, actually, because they thought Turkey would be a good partner, both linguistically, ethnically, but also because of religion, and because the sort of Islamic thing would help kind of the region connect and help them open up a little bit and help them move away from kind of Soviet space and become a stable region that the US and the West could work with. So religion is very important because it didn't used to exist in a way. And so you've got a community that's quite naive in some ways in religious terms. And so it's quite easy to motivate people within that context in this regard. The government's also very aggressive about cracking down on any expression of, religious organization, let's say, that they don't control. For example, I don't know, maybe you heard of an organization called Hizb ut-Tahrir. It's quite active in the region, and it's one that's very actively prosecuted by the government. Now, in other contexts, in parts of Europe, Hizb ut-Tahrir is very active as well, but it's kind of left to its own devices because they're basically seen as a bunch of students who sort of advocate for a caliphate, but never actually do anything about it. They just talk and write reports and so on and so forth. But in the region, they actually persecute them and actually go after them and close them down because they see it as a destabilizing factor. Tablighi Jamaat, another religious Islamic movement, is banned in the region, even though, you know, it's a very prominent global Islamic movement that is basically all about proselytization. So the region is very unforgiving in its sort of crackdowns on religion because it sees religion as a really dangerous destabilizing factor. And that, of course, makes it very attractive to people on the other side. Having said all of that, and I think religion is important, one can't also deny the ethnic questions that come up. So, for example, if we're looking at Kyrgyzstan in particular, when we're looking at sort of people who've radicalized from Kyrgyzstan, they tend to come from the south, and they actually tend to be ethnic Uzbeks. And this has been a big issue because, you know, there's always been a tension in Kyrgyzstan between the Kyrgyz and the Uzbek populations, the north and the south. And the fact that you've seen, you know, the Kyrgyz tend to rule the country and dominate the sort of political structures. And so the Uzbeks feel a bit left out. And there's been inter-C9 violence between them over the years. In 2010, there was a particularly brutal bout. I visited the region just after it, and you could still see buildings on kind of, you know, smoking. And a lot of Uzbeks had left, frankly, because they fled across the border into Uzbekistan, who welcomed them. So that has motivated people as well, you know. But then the final element I'll touch on here, which is always worth remembering and is always important, is actually there are other elements as well, and disenfranchisement of a pretty substantial nature because of the frankly quite corrupt nature of governments in these countries. Not all of them, but, you know, there are problems, and there's a real, you know, if you were to visit Kazakhstan, for example, you go to see what is now called Astana once again, but was briefly called Nur Sultan. The capital, you'll find a gleaming city that looks like Dubai, you know, and you can see a huge amount of money has been spent there, and there's huge wealth. But if you then go to parts of the border regions up in the north, for example, or even down in the south, you can find these old cities which are called mikrorayons, where basically you had a monorayon, so which are basically cities which in Soviet times there was kind of like a toilet factory, and that toilet factory was the local economy. That was it, you know what I mean? And there was, like, you know, a few thousand people lived around, and they all lived off this thing, and they supplied toilets for the entire region or something. Now, of course, in the modern economy, that doesn't work. So what's ended up happening is these places have suffered and not seen a level of investment and return in them. And so they're having a difficult time. And the protests we saw at the beginning of the year were in large part driven by disenfranchisement and unhappiness amongst these people. Now, if you go to Astana, you go to Almaty, you see quite rich cities, you know what I mean? You can see, so that stratification of society does cause a problem. So I say that just to say that ideology, I think, is important, and religion does motivate an awful lot of people. Ethnic does as well, but I wouldn't discount the disenfranchisement. But, you know, if this is an audience of people who look at radicalization, you'll all know well that there is no single issue. It's a multifaceted series of issues, which often is, you know, varied within each individual.
Raffaello, you touched on this a little bit towards the end, but, you know, putting your geopolitical hat on, the war in the Ukraine and the kind of focus that is generating both in the West, sanctions, modern weaponry, training, etc., going to the Ukraine. What do you think that is impact on the Soviet capability to continue to support the stands and play a role there?
Well, it's an interesting question.
Is this part of the potential solution to this war?
That the Russians come back in, or the Russians what? Sorry, I missed the connection to the war. Sorry, the end of the war.
Well, I mean, if the Russians are completely distracted by the Ukraine and focusing all of their resources to, you know, hold the Crimea, meanwhile the stands are, you know, falling apart, and they're at risk of losing that piece of their influence. Is that any, you know?
I see. No, I see. Look, I think it's interesting. I think that there is no doubt that I think Russian security guarantees are probably worth a lot less now than they were before the invasion. And there's been an actual removal of capability. So in Tajikistan, there's a base which the Russians have long had. It's one of their 2 or 3, I think, external bases where there's been a parachute deployment that's been there for a very long time, that's basically is tasked with sort of helping the Tajiks essentially protect their own border. And if we go back and look at the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, the Russians were the ones who rushed in and started doing stuff. We saw them doing joint training exercises with, I think, all of the border countries. We saw them suddenly speed up arms sales to a number of the countries that they're selling a lot of weapons to. We really saw them kind of surging in. But what's interesting is actually outside these two instances, and of course, the Russian support for the Kazakh chaos at the beginning of the year, it's quite difficult to find the Russians actually playing a positive security role in the region. It's something that's talked about and seen in general, but in terms of practical, tangible outcomes, it's certainly not always the case. The trouble I mentioned between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan in 2010, the Russians didn't even try to step in to try to fix that. The repeated border fires you see between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the Russians haven't tried to do anything about that as well. So, you've got a lot of issues in the region. The Russians could kind of play a more paternalistic role in, and they haven't, frankly. Actually, what's interesting over the past year is you've seen President Putin pay an awful lot more attention to the region than I think he had previously. And part of that's been accepting the fact that the region generally thinks that his invasion of Ukraine was a really bad idea. And you've had some very senior leaders in both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan say things to that effect. So, notwithstanding that, though, Russia has seen this erosion of its potential influence, and Mr. Putin's tried to think about how we can kind of shift that. Now, does that mean were you to see widespread chaos in the region, that the Russians suddenly rush over a force to deploy that? I don't know. I think at the moment, I think the Russians would probably be a bit worried about it and would probably do something about it, but I have a suspicion that they would probably try to pluck forces from somewhere else other than Ukraine to try to do that, because I think from their perspective, they're all in on Ukraine and that has to be achieved. And ultimately in Central Asia, they don't have the same sense of ownership over it in the same way. So I think they would be willing to try to let a certain level of chaos take place over there, assuming that essentially it gives them further cards to play going forwards, because the region will sort of want to come to them. So I think that's where Moscow probably sits there. So no, I struggle to see a context where the trouble in Central Asia gets so bad that Mr. Putin says, well, we have to abandon my madness in Ukraine to go and focus on this.
Okay, wishful thinking perhaps on my part. Couple of more questions here. How likely is the possibility of establishing a caliphate in the region, and where would be the most likely location? And the second part to that is, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between criminal and or smuggling gangs and terrorism in the region? In other words,
Sure. I think, look, on the first one, I don't think it's going to happen, to be perfectly honest with you. I think the countries where you can see the largest sort of gaps in security, which maybe someone could take advantage of in that way, would be Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. But even there, I think that the others would help them shut it down if it did start to emerge. But the area that one always talks about is the Fergana Valley, which is the kind of middle part of the region, the most populous part of the most fertile part of the region, where there have traditionally been a lot of, militant groups have come out of there. There's an awful lot of anger and unhappiness there. A lot of it's in Uzbekistan, part of it's in Kyrgyzstan. So that would be the region where I think people would mostly look to if they were to see this. But I'm fairly sanguine that I struggle, frankly, to see it happening, in part because I think the governments there wouldn't tolerate it, and I think they would help each other to clamp down on it. And also because external powers, right, the Chinese, the Russians, the West would probably help as well, not wanting to see something like that take place. So I struggle to see it happening, but I think if it was, it would probably be more realistically happening somewhere in the Fergana Valley, or maybe in because you've got the sort of Sunni influences there as well, and other parts you don't necessarily have in the same strength. So that would be on that one. On the question of relation with criminals, something as terrorism in the region, there is it's very difficult to pin down, to be honest. There's an awful lot of drugs smuggling in this region, of course, coming from Afghanistan through the region into Russia and over into Europe. And a lot of that smuggling, frankly, happens at with reported connections to very, very senior levels of the authorities in those countries. So, I think that it's quite controlled smuggling and criminal activity across the region, which means that for, I think, militant groups, it would be, you'd be treading into difficult turf because you'd be dealing with something that's trying to go after the leader's pocketbook, not just, I think. So I think that there's there is a bit of separation, though there is some overlap at the same time. Militant groups in Afghanistan certainly use drugs as a way of raising money, and no doubt that is taking place to some degree.
Okay, we have one more question from Dr. Cengiz, who's part of our team. Radicalization and joining jihadi groups have been a trend in Central Asia. When these individuals leave their countries and form new groups under the banner of ISIS or Al-Qaeda in conflict zones such as Syria and Afghanistan, what causes the radicalization in Central Asia?
I mean, you know, there's no single issue you can kind of point to. I mean, I think earlier I tried to articulate how, you know, I think Islam, you know, is an attractive narrative to people there. If we look recently, the majority of the Central Asians that we saw radicalized, for example, and go fight in Syria and Iraq, were actually migrant laborers in Russia. You know, there are numbers, reports vary, but somewhere in the region of 7 million Central Asians living in Russia, mostly Uzbek, but large Kyrgyz and Tajik communities as well, doing kind of migrant labor jobs, you know, bartending, truck driving, ditch digging, whatever. And this has been a long-standing tradition. They all have CIS passports, so they can go visa-free back and forth, and they take advantage of that to go into Russia, where they can make more money, which they can send home. Now, when we're talking about Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, you're talking about the remittances, so the money that's sent back, you know, being somewhere in the region of a third, or even some reports of half of national GDP. So it's not an insubstantial number of people, and it's not an insubstantial amount of money. Now, unfortunately, if you're a Central Asian living in Russia, it is not always a very pleasant experience. And, you know, I did a research project on this a few years ago with some Central Asian researchers where they went around Russian cities to interview Central Asian migrants to try to get a feel for what was radicalizing some of them, because it's very noticeable. If you look at those who go fight in Syria, no overwhelming majority, if not all, overwhelming majority came from Russia and were radicalized in Russia. And it's, you know, it's because it's a pretty miserable experience. They're very alienating. They're away from their families. They're in a place where they're getting treated badly. Money is an issue. You know, it's not very pleasant. And the government persecutes them, frankly. And you look, the Russian government quite actively looks and often arrests Central Asians who they accuse of being involved in radicalization. Now, some of them doubtless are, but some of them, it feels sometimes like a bit of persecution. So it's a pretty miserable experience. And I think that at the moment is one of the kind of main issues which seems to be motivating people to go and fight abroad. Now, from Central Asia themselves, it's, I think, the more classic reasons you find, the kind of attractiveness of ISIS, the attractiveness of going to participate in a kind of global struggle, be part of something exciting. The fact that not a lot's going on in large parts of Central Asia, and you've got an awful lot of kind of, you know, idle young men who, frankly, their choices are go work in Russia or go work in Turkey, and, you know, and do pretty, you know, low-level jobs there, or join something exciting like an international jihad. So there are lots of reasons to motivate people to go, and I think that's probably some of them. That, and then the issues I touched on before, talking about religion, talking about some of the ethnic tensions, and talking about some of the economic issues that you see around the region.
Raffaello, you've got one more question. I'm going to try and combine two here. You mentioned tangentially the issue of corruption. And I think it was when we were talking about the drug trade. How can corruption be exploited by terror groups? And secondly, we're just talking about, you know, migrant workers, remittances. You know, what's the issue? What's the challenge if these migrant workers are sent home, given declining economic prospects, or come home because the economies in Russia is declining?
So, I mean, look, on the first one, corruption, I mean, corruption is clearly a motivating factor. If you look at ISK's material, you look at other groups, they clearly talk about the corruption of the secular governments as something which motivates them. And, you know, it does, I think, have an effect. As I said before, in Kazakhstan, you look at the kind of the wealth that you can see in the capital and the poverty you can find in some other parts of the country, and you can understand why people will go, what's going on here, you know? So I think there is an element of that being something that groups can exploit. And I think ISK in particular has been quite targeted in talking about it. But I think other groups have as well, kind of over the years, talking about the corruption of the elites, and they mean that in a kind of moral way, but also in a pecuniary way. So yes, I think it is something that they do exploit to some degree. And then on the migrant labor question, it's a really interesting one, actually, because I've been watching out for this. Now, when the invasion happened earlier in the year, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, my prognostication was this is going to be catastrophic for Central Asia because remittances will just drop, because suddenly the Russian economy will fall through the floor. It'll be miserable and they won't need these laborers. They'll send them all back, or they won't have jobs anymore. And so just you'll meet this flood of young men with no jobs, no prospects, coming back to Central Asia, idling around, and that's always a recipe for trouble. Now, what's interesting is actually it hasn't really played out like that yet. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to in the future, or the short, medium-term future, I don't know. But the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, did a very interesting study, which they published relatively recently, which they said actually remittances values had gone up, in fact, because it seemed as though there was still a labor need in Russia. And actually the Russian economy, it's been damaged, but it hasn't been damaged as much as I think the expectation was, frankly. And they do still seem to be able to do it. I think energy is probably a major driver of this, but I think the beating that the Russian economy has taken hasn't been as bad as everyone's expecting. And so what you've had is you've had this kind of, there is still a need for this labor in Russia. And so there actually is still money kind of seeming to flow back. Initially, in the initial days, there was a kind of drop when I think there was a kind of general panic and everyone started worrying what was going to happen. And also US dollars, which is the kind of currency, the fiat currency everyone uses in the region, because the local currencies, the som or the ruble in Russia, they tend to use USD. Suddenly you saw a lot of USD flow into Russia, as I think people are frankly trying to arbitrage the system. And that caused a huge problem in the region because, of course, dollar is very important. And so it caused an interesting friction there. But since then, actually, this situation doesn't seem to be as bad as everyone expected, or at least I expected. Maybe others saw this coming. I did not. And, it was interesting also to see that there's been an interesting exflow of companies and capital from Russia into Central Asia. And this is not only, Russian companies that are trying to sort of get out, but also foreign companies that were based in Russia, finding another place that they want to operate from. Huawei, the Chinese tech company that I'm positive everyone's heard of, they moved their Russian operations. They stopped doing business in Russia and moved everything to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and increased their kind of footprint there. Now, I think that's to try to sell stuff into Russia sort of in some discreet way, but, there is a noticeable shift that you've seen happen. So actually the sort of the negative economy story hasn't played out yet. That's not to say it's not going to. I think if it does, it's really a risk for the Central Asians because, as I say, large populations of young men with nothing to do and no prospects is never, ever a good recipe. But at the moment, it actually hasn't played out as I think everyone's expecting.
Raffaello, I promised you 45 minutes. I know it's late for you in Singapore and that you have young children. So we will end there. I'd like to thank you on behalf of all of the group for a very interesting presentation about a region which we often don't focus much attention to. I'd like to thank everybody.
I would recommend everyone to travel to, sorry, because there's a really beautiful part of the region. We're talking about the dark side of it here, and there are lots of problems, but it really is a region I would highly encourage anyone to go visit just to see, because the people are lovely and there's incredible history there. So yeah.
I mean, I've only been to Astana.
My advertising bit there.
I've only been to Astana, and you're quite right.
Okay.
Reminded me a little bit of Dubai or Abu Dhabi.
Yes. Well, that's, I'd argue, the exception. The other cities, go visit sort of ancient cities, Khiva, Bukhara, Samarkand, or ancient Mari and Turkmenistan. These are extraordinarily historic places, and I would recommend it.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And
thank you.
Stay tuned for the next one. Raffaello, thank you very much again.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.